It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce Randi Rashkover. Randi is the Nathan and Sophia Gumenek Chair of Judaic Studies and Professor of Religious Studies and Director of Judaic Studies at William and Mary. Her areas of expertise include Jewish philosophy, Jewish Christian comparative theology, Jewish political thought, and philosophy of religion. Time doesn't permit me today to talk about all of the extraordinary energy and insight and brilliance she brings to Jewish thought and to theology more generally, especially in North America. And we really are delighted to have you here. I want to mention a few of Professor Rashkover's books. First, Revelation and Theopolitics, Bart Rosenzweig and the Politics of Praise in 2005. In 2011, Freedom and Law, a Jewish Christian apologetics, and forthcoming, hot off the press, Nature and Norm, Judaism, Christianity, and Theopolitical Problem. There are two new books that we look forward to reading and receiving. First, Judaism, Tradition, and Continuity, a philosophical perspective, and the Akedah, Theology and Its Limits. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rashkover. Thank you.
The title.
Judaism, Humanism and Inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindy. Thank you so much. So it is really, really lovely to be here, and Sarah just walked in, and that makes it all better. It's lovely to be here in Oxford. For years, I went to Cambridge over and over again, and I got yelled at all the time for walking on the grass. I didn't realize, one day I was sitting there, and I was having a cup of coffee, and it was in the days where I would smoke a cigarette, and I was sitting there on, in the grass, having a cup of coffee and whatever, and then I was told, politely that I wasn't supposed to, but nobody's yelled at me here in Oxford yet, so I feel it's very nice. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Hindy. It was good to hear about your work. I'm really thrilled to be here, mostly because of Luke. I'm really excited about what Luke's trying to do here, and I want to learn more about it, and I'm proud of you, and we all sort of knew that Luke had to leave the United States and come back at some point, so couldn't be a better place for him to come back to. So the title of the talk's changed a little bit, but who cares? Okay, so the theme of the conference is fortuitous for me, because a lot of my work in the past, this is going to be you're going to suffer through this paper, sorry. So the theme of the conference is rather fortuitous for me, because a lot of my work in the past 2 years has been devoted, sorry, that's Leo Betnitsky, turn that off, has been devoted to developing new orientations to standard questions of truth, revelation, and human problem solving in relation to matters of Jewish theology and Jewish-Christian theological relations. Indeed, the catalyst and the outcome of this new orientation is what we might refer to as a new humanism. In my talk today, I'm going to introduce us to this new humanism through a reconstruction of the state of Jewish-Christian theological work. So it's widely recognized, of course, that a new chapter in Jewish-Christian theological relations emerged in the wake of the Holocaust and Vatican II. Even so, critical point number one, these developments have been frequently accompanied by an anxiety over what is perceived to be a tension between Jewish-Christian exchange and the stability of each tradition. A classic statement of this anxiety appears in my beloved Dr. Vater's, David Novak's article, a very famous article, Supersessionism, Hard and Soft, that was published in First Things in 2019. By supersessionism, Novak doesn't simply refer to the Christian notion that, quote, the Christian church has superseded the Jewish people, assuming their role as God's covenanted people, Israel, unquote. But no, David refers to the idea of supersession as the broader philosophical notion that one tradition holds absolute truth claims that invalidate another. Nonetheless, David maintains that there are two forms of supersessionism. The first he calls hard supersessionism, which consists of external attempts to convert Jews by Christians, or on the Jewish side, the Jewish indifference or outright dismissal of Christianity as a form of paganism. So he's not excluding supersessionism as being something that both Jewish and Christian traditions do vis-a-vis each other. The second form of supersession he labels soft supersessionism, which refers to modes of Jewish or Christian engagement with the other that maintain confidence in the unique and unrivaled truth of each tradition's respective revelation and accompanying norms, but identify theological conditions that permit or encourage positive engagement or dialogue with the other. For example, the Christian appeal to the Pauline notion of God's eschatological treatment of the Jews maintains the absolute theological difference between Judaism and Christianity, but opens possibilities for Christians to let Jews take the wheel, if you will, when it comes to Jews, such that contemporary Christians need not actively pursue their conversion. Most significantly, next important point, Novak rejects hard supersessionism, but he accepts forms of soft supersessionism. Here's his fundamental claim. Both Christians and Jews should reject forms of hard supersessionism, he argues. Why? Because we live in times when they have to combine forces in their fight against secularism. Christians should no longer seek to missionize Jews, and Jews should recognize Christians as monotheists and allies in their effort to, quote, confront a common enemy, militant secularism, unquote. Indeed, it's this practical endeavor, coupled with an appreciation of a range of common moral norms, natural laws, that constitute the heart of contemporary Jewish-Christian relations in Novak's work. If, however, Novak promotes Jewish-Christian dialogue for the purpose of A, appreciating shared natural law, and B, combating secularism, he also insists that such a relation does not, and indeed should not, threaten each tradition's right to maintain the absolute validity of their revelatory tradition over and against the other. Even an active Jewish-Christian dialogue needs, in his view, to retain some degree of soft supersessionism, since otherwise, he argues, the absolute validity of each tradition's revelatory tradition is in question, and the ongoing motivation of its adherents is at risk. As he states, I won't read the whole quote, but a complete denial of supersessionism leaves Christians, you have to listen to the arguments, leaves Christians unable to affirm Christianity as having brought something new and fuller to the ancient covenant between God and Israel. Without some kind of supersessionism, Christians have no cogent reason for not going back to their Jewish origins. Without some kind of supersessionism on our part, Jews like me, David says, would have no cogent reason for not going forward into what Christians regard as Judaism's fulfillment, unquote. Without maintenance of some appeal to the absolute validity of one's revelatory tradition, adherents engaged in Jewish-Christian encounters run the risk of undermining the grounds for their commitment to their own tradition. While David concedes that Judaism and Christianity both recognize the revelatory significance of the Hebrew Scriptures, for example, they disagree regarding the normative interpretation of this text. And as he explains, these interpretations and the normative worldviews they generate, and here's another telling quote, are not, David says, the kind of differences where it can be said, you have your truth and we have ours. Rather, these are differences that concern the ultimate level of truth, corresponding to ultimate reality. They concern our relationship to God. Here, the difference between Judaism and Christianity is the starkest. It's a matter of either or. I'll leave the quote there. A Jewish-Christian dialogue that aspires to complete dissolution of supersessionism inevitably works against the interest of each tradition. This is David's argument, and a soft supersessionist position of some desirable sort constitutes a necessary condition of Jewish-Christian engagement. To his credit, David recognizes that as human beings, our assertions concerning absolute truth are always qualified by God's eschatological prerogative. Even so, and ironically, Novak does not appeal to the ultimate eschatologically determined finitude of human assertions as his primary point of orientation for JC relations, but rather to the contemporary battle between Judaism, Christianity, and secularism, and what is his insistence on their soft supersessionist position with regard to each other. Today, I want to offer a review of this widely held theophilosophical position from the perspective of an account of the fallibility of our claims about revealed traditions. From here, I'm going to illuminate a picture of Jewish-Christian relations that entirely offsets the assumptions and the anxiety at work in David's account. For our purposes, I'm going to provide two angles on the fallibility question. One is Peter Oakes's and one is mine, even if the two are very similar. Let's start with Peter's. In an article entitled Domains, Normativity, and Normativity Across Domains, a very good friend of all of ours, Susanna Ticciati, offers the following description of Peter's account of scriptural revelation. So this is Susanna describing Peter's account of revelation. Peter, she says, distinguishes in rabbinic terms between the will of the absolute as displayed in the plain sense of Scripture, but only indeterminately, and the determinate meanings that are arrived at by historically specific communities of readers. For finite creatures, only the latter have truth values. In another Reformation, that's one of Peter's books that Susanna is referring to, Peter clarifies, we may declare, we have heard directly from the one whose word is true universally, yes indeed, but we are not the ones to articulate the universality of this word, unquote from Susanna. Here Susanna uses the term indeterminate to describe Peter's account of how the will of the absolute is presented in scriptural revelation. Peter, often pulling from Peirce, uses the term vague. A vague concept is one whose full meaning is reliant upon its determination across a range of possible contexts. Thus, in Oakes's view, scriptural revelation, this is the key point coming out of Peter, thus in Oakes's view, scriptural revelation is not a set of truth claims, but formally speaking, a condition of the possibility of the human determinant of truth claims. In this case, truth claims generated through processes of scriptural exegesis and interpretation, not that different from what Hindy was just saying. As such, for Peter, the wisdom of the text is not therefore synonymous with the truth claims that we formulate, but with the text's ability to foster our hermeneutical attempts to formulate them. Moreover, human determination of vague claims into truth-determinate claims is always a context-conditioned activity. As finite creatures, human beings develop assertoric propositions, that is to say, determinations concerning what we take to be the case or not to be the case. We make assertoric propositions about what we know within the limits of our finitude, our physical, historical, political, economic particularity, and location. Thus, truth claims, or in this case, exegetical determinations of Scripture's contents, are features of human life and not features of scriptural revelation itself, and as such are inevitably finite or fallible. There is no such thing, this is one of the really nice claims that you get out of Peter, there's no such thing in Peter's account of an absolute truth claim, or at least not one that we as human beings can access or lay claim to. Absolute truth, to the extent that there is any, is simply not tantamount to our conception of and ways of handling what we call truth. Certainly, one might wonder why, for Peter, scriptural polyvalence registers as wisdom and not simply as possibility. To speak of a scriptural tradition as sacred for him is to speak of how it operates as a catalyst for the human development of ways of life that promote human flourishing and respond to human suffering. And here's the fundamental claim vis-a-vis the conversation with David. As such, Peter does not worry about threats to Judaism's continuity or Christianity's continuity, and this is not because, like David or others, he finds refuge in absolute assertions of the absolute validity of revelation, but because Peter has confidence in the wisdom afforded by these traditions, as this wisdom is articulated in the form of living habits, theoretical and practical, that promote human flourishing and repair human alienation in the created order. Note, Peter's claim that truth claims concerning revelation are a human enterprise does not mean, and this is an important point for those of you who are interested in Rosenzweig, if there's any Rosenzweigians out there, Peter's claim that truth claims concerning revelation are a human enterprise does not mean that revelation is non-propositional or beyond propositionality. Such a move would render Peter's view vulnerable to charges of what I elsewhere call arbitrary anchoring, or an expression of what I call an appeal to amor that's devoid of any humanly derived meaning. Peter's view, if you didn't catch that, you can follow this sentence. Peter's view is not that revelation is non-propositionalizable, but that it's only propositionalizable through finite human determinations. As promised, I'd like to offer a second angle from which we can appreciate the fallibility of claims regarding revelatory traditions, and from which we may find relief from the kind of anxiety regarding Jewish-Christian relations that accompanies Novak's account. So again, Novak's telling us that we've got to have some soft supersessionism in Jewish-Christian relations. Jewish-Christian relations mean that we have to harbor some kind of fidelity to the absolute validity of our claims, because if we don't have some degree of supersessionism, then we won't have, he says, any reason to sustain our commitment to our claims. That's the anxiety that folks like Novak and it's a very common position. And so I'm trying to show you that we don't have to have that anxiety, and therefore getting rid of supersessionism is surely something that not only we can do, but something that we must do, or that we're going to benefit from doing when we engage in Jewish-Christian relations. So, as noted above, Novak presupposes, so here's me just saying what I just said, Novak above presupposes that the recourse to the absolute validity, the supersessionism of one's religious position is a necessary feature of Jewish-Christian engagement, because without it, the engagement threatens to promote syncretism or relativism. As we've seen, Oakes would suggest that this anxiety is misplaced. Both Peter and I will maintain that neither Jews nor Christians need to fear the dissolution of supersessionism. Oakes maintains that revelatory traditions just aren't the kinds of things that one can be supersessionist about. I'll claim that even if Peter is right, that they're not the kinds of things that one can be supersessionist about, that a lot of human beings are fully capable of presenting them as such, but that these efforts are ideological, but here's the fundamental point, ultimately self-destructive for the members of both traditions. So I'm going to argue that recognition of the fallibility of revelatory claims is actually a condition of those traditions' own continuity, such that what adherents should fear most is not the dissolution of supersession, but its retention in any form. That is to say, adherents of these traditions should themselves be concerned with the retention of supersessionism, because I'm going to argue it threatens their own continuity. The central contention of the analysis is that claims must be fallible to be true. By this I mean that the determination of a claim as true is the determination of it as true. A true claim undergoes a test, or is a claim that's accompanied by an account of what makes it true. But a claim that's true, insofar as it's accompanied by such an account, is conditionally true or fallible. While this may at first seem counterintuitive, it's not hard to see that the assertion of a claim is true without an account of what makes it true is vulnerable to the skeptic who asks, how do you know that this is always the case, that X is true? How is this different from Y? In response to which the respondent would need to provide an account to preserve the integrity of the claim. Minus such an account, the skeptic can justifiably accuse the claimant of irrationality, dogmatism, or both. Thus, a true claim is only true and neither arbitrary nor dogmatic by virtue of its fallibility. When Novak argues in favor of supersessionism as a philosophical position, he argues in favor of the absolute validity of revelatory claims. Thus, by supersessionism, he doesn't mean to refer to the truth of the tradition or its claims, since such a position would permit the possibility of an argument for or against it. This is something that McIntyre understands. That's not here, but somebody mentioned McIntyre yesterday. Rather, as noted above, he appeals to the absolute validity of his tradition, since he claims without it the Jew would have no reason to remain a Jew and the Christian no reason to remain a Christian. Apparently, either David A. does not want Jewish-Christian relations to be exercises in the advancement of strong reasons in favor of the truth of one or the other's positions. Maybe he doesn't want that kind of Jewish-Christian dialogue. Or B, and I think this is probably more likely the claim, David doesn't see how Jewish-Christian relations could be an exercise. He can't imagine what kinds of reasons each might bring to the table. I.e., he doesn't think that the truth of a revelatory tradition is the kind of truth for which there could be reasons. In either case, he holds that only an appeal to absolute validity, the untested, unaccounted for validity of the revelatory tradition, can secure adherence. Thus, when Novak asserts the absolute validity of one's respective traditions, he takes the question of this validity off the table and instead suggests that revelatory tradition is not only absolutely true, but the ground or the standard of what constitutes truth and falsehood at all. While Novak concedes that within this framework, a tradition posits, so this is an important point, while Novak concedes that within this framework, a tradition can posit true or false claims, and a tradition can foster its own internal arguments with regard to the truth and falsehood of particular claims, his position implies that these true and false claims are fallible only in relation to each other and can only be critiqued by adherents who sustain a shared assumption regarding the absolute validity of the revelatory tradition and not by critics outside of this framework. While at first glance such a view seems to resemble Peter's account of how religious tradition functions, it differs in one crucial respect, which I'm sure now you can see. Novak's support of soft supersessionism indicates that his revelatory tradition is absolutely valid, while Peter maintains that scriptural revelations are not the kinds of things about which one says that they're true or not, since the language of truth is ours and is such always fallible. Okay, so that's them. To appreciate the philosophical problems associated with the appeals to absolute validity of foundational claims, we can refer to Leo Strauss's analysis of the irrationality of the modern scientific position. So here I'm invoking Strauss because he offers a very, very nice critique of the philosophical problem of the appeal to absolute validity. The example he's going to use is going to be the Enlightenment, but we can apply it to any philosophical position that appeals to a claim of absolute validity. In his 1935 text, Philosophy and Law, Strauss argues that the Enlightenment's claim to monopolize truth vis-a-vis the success of natural science can be traced back to Spinoza's account of the human knowledge of nature and his robust critique of revelation and miracles. But Strauss argues, and it's interesting when you get a philosopher like Strauss critiquing the rationality of science, in this case Spinozistic grounds of science, but it will be science, modern science in a certain capacity. Strauss argues that Spinoza's scientific denial of the possibility of miracles only succeeds if one takes for granted the exclusive logical validity of scientific knowledge. To be convincing, Strauss says, Spinoza's critique of miracles and revelation would have to, quote, depend on metaphysical support or on an account of how scientific knowledge alone adequately and absolutely refers to how things are. Spinoza doesn't provide such a metaphysical account, Strauss says, but merely assumes the self-evidence of naturalistic criteria. He permits his argument to rest on unargued premises and refuses to engage with possible challenges to his position. What had been an account of the truth of natural science, thereby, Strauss says, degenerates into an absolutism that neglects the skeptic's challenge and undermines its own claims to knowledge. In Philosophy and Law, Strauss attributes the same pattern to the modern Enlightenment more generally. There he argues that, like Spinoza, modern Enlightenment thinkers refuse to quarrel with orthodoxy and insist that natural science's practical successes signal its absolute epistemic superiority in claims in relation to revelation. If, however, the Enlightenment's tendency toward epistemic absolutism had its modern roots in Spinoza, Strauss asserts that its foundational inspiration is, and I debated taking this out, but I didn't, asserts that its foundational inspiration is in Catholicism's identification between reason and revelation. Easily misunderstood, Strauss's critique of Thomistic scholasticism is not a call for an absolute severance between theology and revelation. You'll hear the point in a second. It's not the relation between reason and revelation that worries Strauss, but the identification of the two as absolute that worries him, and which he thinks filters down to the modern Enlightenment. Okay, so like its scholastic forebearer, the modern Enlightenment refuses to recognize its own limits, this is Strauss's fundamental point, and refuses to concede the prospect of falsification. We're going to apply all of this to Judaism and Christianity in a second. A willful rejection of the prospect of new information of data that might alter its account of truth, Strauss says. The Enlightenment position is anti-scientific and leads to the devolution of scientific claims into subjective position or historicist assertion. The very Enlightenment that touts natural science and modern reason undermines science and reason and introduces cracks into the foundation of civilization. That's Strauss. His story, his music is very similar to the claim that I'll make now. From here, it's easy to recognize the negative consequences of the insistence on claims to absolute validity, theological or non-theological. Most significantly, appeals to absolute validity are attempts to shield foundational and internal claims from the potential falsifications that may emerge from encounters with the world and encounters with other accounts of the world that may challenge their epistemic superiority. That's the key philosophical claim of what follows. Thus, appeals to absolute validity are attempts to ignore and thwart ongoing knowledge of the world and ongoing knowledge of other approaches to it. There are two primary negative entailments of this approach. First, rather than secure the continuity of each tradition, the appeal to absolute validity destabilizes it. While I do not maintain that the ability to offer an account of how X claim makes sense in relation to other things we know about the world, what I will refer to as its truth, intelligibility, or in Dewey's language, its warranted assertability of revelatory claims, is the sole and exclusive meaning or worth of revelatory claims. But I do hold that intelligibility, this is the key point, constitutes a minimal condition of the possibility of ongoing commitment to a tradition. While ideologues who insist upon the unfalsifiability of claims are skilled at deploying a robust range of tools to maintain adherent commitment to dogmatic or irrational claims, in the long run, I argue, ideologies lose their power when the contradictions and unintelligibility of their positions is exposed. When there's no way to distinguish between the absolute validity of a position and its fantastical character, adherents, I argue, will likely question their commitment to said view and leave it in search of other worldviews. Okay. Second, and perhaps and for our gathering here, the more important point, an even more damaging entailment of the irrationality of the appeal to absolute validity is its failure to help human beings develop the knowledge they need to solve human problems. By limiting what counts as legitimate knowledge to the field of revelatory knowledge or this closed system, despite the irrationality of this position, such an approach or insistence on the absolute validity of a single revelatory framework prohibits the ongoing encounter with the world, that is to say, inquiry, that can generate knowledge discourses that exceeds the bounds of a finite and fixed account of truth and falsity. Thus, it inevitably alienates human beings from the world and from the possibility of developing knowledge of the world that they need to promote flourishing. By contrast, an account of human knowledge development in the context of what I refer to as the philosophical pursuit of truth, which is a Straussian view, the philosophical pursuit of truth, by which I mean the ongoing encounter between human inquiry and the world, that invites the work of a great multiplicity of worldviews or discourses and modes of inquiry in the service of human problem solving, and not in the service of the endorsement of a hegemonic account of truth and falsity. The appreciation of the fallibility of truth claims is necessary for the project of the pursuit of human flourishing in the world, and the appeal to absolute validity vis-a-vis its foundationalist approach obstructs it. Not only does the commitment to supersessionism secure the unintelligibility and ideological character of each respective tradition, it thwarts the human effort to reconcile itself with the world, or what is nothing other than the fulfillment of God's project for human beings within his created order. The above account of the fallibility of revelatory claims in hand, I'm just going to quickly sketch a different account of Jewish-Christian relations than the one presented in Novak's view. First, An account of Jewish-Christian relations in light of the fallibility of claims is an account that has nothing to do with supersessionism and is devoid of the latent antagonism or inclination to battle it out on the field of normative claims. Neither tradition arrives at the table fueled by a latent self-certainty, and neither need be threatened by the latent polemicism of the other tradition. While Novak and others opt for versions of soft supersessionism, this position guarantees that Jewish-Christian encounters maintain the conditions for these, even if they discourage adherence. Okay, never mind. By contrast, this position that Jewish-Christian relations operate without appeals to absolute validity are free of the rivalry and explicit or implicit impulse to assert the invalidity of the other positions. Moreover, not only does an appreciation of the fallibility of JC claims eliminate the rivalrous and potentially deadly character of Jewish relations, it also has the potential to orient them in an entirely new direction. The history of Jewish-Christian relations can be identified by three phases: an adversarial, an argumentative, apologetic, and a pragmatic. I'm going to skip the first two and just run to the third one that I call the pragmatic phase. The adversarial is easy to understand. It's early supersessionism. The argumentative is Mendelssohn and Kant, something like that. The third phase is the pragmatic phase. The pragmatic phase, is what I'm proposing here, presupposes the fallibility of claims concerning revelation. And indeed, it also has the central contention of this analysis that blah, 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 it vastly outweighs the negatives of the earlier phases. This is because the pragmatic phase is an entailment of the principle of human flourishing that accompanies the account of fallibility. As discussed above, applied to religious traditions or any worldview, the principle of human flourishing or the workability of claims is the principle that for claims to retain value or worth over time, they have to be intelligible or workable for those who hold them. When by workable, I mean they comport with other things we know about the world and facilitate our ways of being in the world. This means at once that their philosophical truth status is context dependent upon the ongoing human inquiry into how things are, when how things are is a reflection of the cognitive habits human beings develop in relation to their world for the purpose of sustaining their adaptation and flourishing within it. Seen from such a perspective, truth or absolute truth amounts to, and it does have some significance here, the hypothetical and always deferred future notion of the sum of all collectively retained or pragmatically successful human cognitive habits. Such a conception of truth is not only indeterminate, vague, and always incomplete, but its primary function is regulative. By regulative, I mean this conception of truth that I'm advancing here is the ongoing pursuit of truth over the course of inquiry. By regulative, I mean it illuminates and it can remind adherents of particular traditions that of certain cognitive norms implicit in the pragmatic fallibility of claims. For example, it illuminates the cognitive norm or principle that fallibly held claims are claims that human beings maintain when they support the human effort to adapt and sustain well-being in relation to the world as their primary element, and not when they are deployed as anti-pragmatic declarations of cognitive superiority. Thus, the key to the following analysis of the third phase of Jewish-Christian relations is recognition of the regulative impact of this notion of truth and its accompanying account of worldviews and scientific discourses as agents of the ongoing pursuit of truth. What the effect of that is on the behavior of Jews and Christians engaged in interreligious encounters. Arguably, the regulative impact of this notion generates several pragmatically motivated stages between Judaism and Christianity. So one effect, I'll list three of them very quickly and then I'll finish up. The first stage is a pragmatically motivated encounter between one tradition and another, when adherents of one tradition recognize the limits in the tradition's ability to solve worldly problems. The second stage, so let me talk about that one first and then I'll do the other two. The first stage in a pragmatically motivated encounter between Judaism and Christianity derives from the regulative notion that given the character of truth assertion and inquiry, worldviews will seek out encounters with other worldviews when they find themselves in situations that expose their problem-solving limits. A good example from Judaism is the encounter between medieval Jewish legal thinkers known as the Barcelona School and their appeal to features of non-Jewish political theory. As Menachem Lorberbaum discusses in a famous book, Politics and the Limits of Law, schools of halakhic exegesis, like the Barcelona school in the 13th and 14th centuries, associated with scholars like Moses Nachmanides, Solomon Adret, and Nissim ben Reuben Gerandi, they demonstrate how, and this is something that I think can happen in Jewish-Christian relations, they demonstrate how halakhic thought itself promotes the development of extra-halakhic political discourse. According to Lorberbaum, quote, this broad scope of inquiry made possible by circumscribing the domain of the halakha reflects the fact that while any legal system is at the mercy of political power, the adequacy of the provisions made by a system of law for the existence of a viable political regime remains an ongoing preoccupation of the greatest scholars of that tradition. The primary focus of the Barcelona school's extra-halakhic inquiry happened to revolve around the matter of public law. But a tradition can see itself as finite and limited with respect to a whole number of issues that are critical for problem solving and realize that they need to dip into the advances and benefits of another discourse in order to complete their own. For our purposes here, these Barcelonian scholars' recognition of the need for public law and their development of a discourse of inquiry around this topic offers a good example of how halakhic scholars sustain an awareness of the limits of halakha and of the need to not only encounter but even incorporate extra halakhic discourses that can offer the transcendental conditions for the possibility of events and realities that exceed the framework of the halakhic system itself. But this encounter between rabbinic thought and non-Jewish political thought as a paradigm illuminates only stage one of the pragmatic account of Jewish, non-Jewish relations, no doubt. Like earlier, so it does operate, and this is something we might want to investigate, from a position of self-interest, or what is the desire of the halakhic tradition to preserve itself. We look to other traditions to engage in problem solving for the sake of helping our own tradition be able to survive. Even so, the desire to preserve itself here is qualified or curtailed by the sober recognition of the worldly constraints that impinge upon this desire and have to be frankly and honestly responded to, lest confidence in one's worldview's intelligibility is upset. As such, the desire for self-preservation is inevitably coterminous, and this is the key point, with the sober awareness of the potential value or worth of claims arising from other discourses or sciences. Clearly, the fundamental notion behind such a pragmatically motivated encounter with non-Jewish discourses is the principle that Jewish communities do not live insular existences, but inhabit a shared world with others. And insofar as other communities have developed modes of inquiry that offer knowledge claims concerning that world, it's inevitable that Jewish communal processes of discerning and developing Judaism's own normative claims will on occasion seek to avail themselves of the findings of the diverse range of non-Jewish discourses, Christianity as the case in hand. Even so, a Judaism that pursues encounters with non-Jewish traditions of human flourishing doesn't just do so for the sake of human well-being, does so for the sake of human well-being, but not only for the sake of its own communal needs. We have to return to the above principle that Jewish communities inhabit a shared world. This is the maximalist notion, and I end with this one. We may return to the above principle that Jewish communities, Christian communities, any communities, inhabit a shared world with others to recognize another entailment of the regulative principle of deferred truth for Jewish engagement with non-Jewish discourses. Not only does the principle of human flourishing lead to one tradition's occasional deployment of other discourses, it leads to a tradition's awareness of the need for that tradition to be minimally compatible with other sciences and discourses. So I've upped the philosophical ante just one little piece. You have to be minimally compatible with other sciences and discourses that co-participate in the ongoing pursuit of truth, as the always deferred notion of the sum total of habits and conditions that resolve human problems. It doesn't serve our way of life's interests if we permit or foster ignorance of other discourses of tradition. A community can only quarantine itself from the effects of the wider world for so long until it becomes unintelligible to its adherents who encounter this wider world. Regulatively speaking, such a principle will normatively prompt Jews and Christians to acquire a basic knowledge of one another's way of life. No doubt the minimal demand that Judaism claims and practices be compatible with other non-Jewish modes of knowledge production does arise from Judaism's need to sustain itself in history, because a Judaism completely alienated from the world or dismissed as an attempt to thwart processes of human flourishing is a Judaism that's marginalized, will lose its historical significance over time. The ongoing pursuit of the normative validity of Jewish claims and practices thereby requires a minimal degree of compatibility. Nonetheless, and it's the last paragraph, this inward-facing need does, in fact, translate into the outward-facing demand that Jewish communities, Christian communities, must strive not only for compatibility with other traditions and discourses that contribute to human flourishing, but they should work to actively support them. Like all other communities, Jews need this world to be inhabitable. This demand only increases as the world becomes a smaller place and generates what scholars these days call complex problems that are far-reaching and from which few communities can remain immune, and problems that are not adequately addressed by the application of one or two, at most, spheres of inquiry or science, but require a full plurality of knowledge discourses to tackle. Applied to Jewish-Christian relations, this means that Jews and Christians need to work together to identify, be informed of, and help respond to complex problems. Moreover, it means that Jews and Christians ought to collaborate, and this is an important point from yesterday, in support of societal institutions that endorse the pragmatic pursuit of truth and the health and vitality of the multiplicity of discourses required to engage in the work of complex human problem solving. In sum, an appreciation of the fallibility of revelatory claims within the context of the pursuit of human flourishing in a shared world catapults Jews and Christians into an entirely new normative environment, which invites them to understand how Jewish-Christian engagement need not be inhibited by an anxiety over the preservation of rivalrous positions of revelatory truth. It's not to say that Jewish-Christian relations understood within this context might not stimulate traditions to offer strong arguments for validity of other claims, but it does mean that a protectionist supersessionism need not have any bearing on the character of Jewish-Christian relations at all, nor should it be permitted to overshadow the development of Jewish-Christian relations that can bring out the best of what each of these traditions has to offer to a suffering world. Thank you.